Thank you. So I guess I'm going to talk about what happens when you write that up, Darren, into a paper and it comes to reviewers, based on, these will be examples from my own experience as an author as well, but I'm also on the editorial board of AMJ and all studies, and so I get a lot of these kinds of papers coming to me as reviewer as well as an author myself. So what I thought might be helpful to everybody is thinking about or giving you some actual examples of my own experiences of trying to write up these kinds of contexts. So I don't do anything nearly as exciting as what Darren does. So I do hospital emergency departments. I've done a fair bit of work on those. The examples I'll give you today will be taken from two papers. So one is, is it not changing? No. That didn't change, did it? No. I'm terrible at this.
I had the same issue. I just restarted PowerPoint.
Did that work? Oh, you've got my slides, actually. Do you want to just, and then I'll tell you when to change a slide? Is
Very
that
good.
easier?
Yeah, let's try that.
Yeah, that might work. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, so I thought it might be helpful. I've gone back through my some of my papers and the reviewers' comments through the review process. So I've tried to identify some of the main feedback you often get or responses you'll get from reviewers. So yeah, just a second slide, Darren, would be good. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, this is based on two papers, but the general trends, the themes, in terms of often the responses you'll get when you try to write this stuff up are fairly generic across all extreme context work and often other research as well. So based on two studies of hospital emergency departments, the first one was published in AMJ and it's ended up being, and you'll see in a moment why I say ended up being about, maintaining the values of profession, so institutional work and moral emotions in the emergency department. And the second one is the paper that was out recently on places of social inclusion that Darren mentioned. And it's on the emergency department. It has got Ebola in the title. Ebola was much less by the end of the review process. And it was interesting, we did have one reviewer suggest that we should take Ebola out of the title when we published it, but obviously we left it in because it's quite topical. Yeah, so if you just want to click on the next one for me. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so what are some of the trends that you often get or the big responses you'll often get from a reviewer? The first one is often, or one that I've got a lot, and maybe you have too, is you're forced a theoretical framing onto your extreme context data. So in other words, your research question is over anticipating your findings. So sometimes you'll get that one, right? So in Darren's examples, he's studying his storm chasers and, you know, he writes this exciting paper up and he'll get a reviewer that says you're forcing this framing. So I've had that too. The AMJ paper, yeah, you can pop the question up now. This was the question we went in with. I'm not sure why. It wasn't the question that drove our data collection, but at the time when we first submitted the paper and wrote it up, we were thinking, oh yeah, there's, you know, intentionality, institutional guardians, maintenance work. So that's kind of what we ended up with. That was kind of how we coded our data. What are the micro processes that shift the intentionality of institutional guardians, maintenance work? That's a terrible research question, and you'll see that the editor thought so too. So if you click again, Darren, it should come up. Yeah, so this is from the decision letter. So you can see what the editor has said, that they felt its tightly worded research question is limiting its theoretical potential. It over-anticipates, right? We're over-anticipating the findings, and we were. We coded, we knew what we were going to find, went back and rewrote the research question to match what ends up in the findings, which is often something that I think we often instinctively do as qualitative researchers. When you're working inductively, you code your data, you come up with something and you think, okay, when I write this up in a paper now, I just need to go back and make that my research question, right? And then my findings will fit. So what you're doing there as the editor and one of the reviewers was suggesting is that we're not allowing the data to breeze at all, and kind of they're suggesting that we should go back, right? So go back and reanalyze your data, with a much more open question and see what you come up with. So as it says there, getting a sense that we're kind of over anticipating and the institutional framing seems forced. And that's often, I think, what extreme, when you're collecting data and trying to write up on these exciting extreme contexts, there's a tendency to do that because you're conscious that you've got to get some kind of theoretical framing. And so you write these research questions that are really tightly connected to what you think you've got in your findings, but it doesn't work in terms of writing the thing up. Often, so if you look at that question, that was actually our answer. It wasn't the question we went in with. We've kind of over anticipated the finding. That was part of the answer, but it was also way too theoretical and whatever. So then our response to that, you can click it there and it should come up. So this is the actual response we gave to the editor, and you'll see later how we got that question. But we took this advice on board and broadened the research question. It now reads, how do actors engage in institutional work to maintain professional values in organisational practices? So it's much, you can see that second question compared to the original question, much better, much more open, much more allows your data to do things. It's a question that you can engage theoretically with. You can see extreme context isn't mentioned in that question, but using an extreme context to explore that. So in our case, hospital emergency departments, it allowed us to say something important and theoretically salient about professional values. And that's an important question for theory, but also for practice. So how does someone maintain in a hospital emergency department their values of operating in the best interest of the patient in these really busy, extreme kind of settings? So that's an important question both for theory and practice. But that second version of that more open crafting is a much better research question. So so I'm being very open here. These are mistakes I've made myself. I still see them when as a reviewer on papers, but it's very easy to do. It's often your first instinct. You're writing this up, you've coded the data, you've got this great model, and so then you think, oh, I'll make my research question fit, right? So you should be thinking about your research question as, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be lecturing to people, do what you like. For me, I need to think about the research question as, so what's the open thing I'm exploring here? What's the difference between my question and my answer? So often for me, it's what can I get to from the literature? That's what the question will be. If I can't get something from the literature, maybe that's me over anticipating what the answer is, that's the answer. So you've kind of got to get that separation. That's the trouble with writing up not only extreme context work, but extreme context work based on field work, right? So you really understand your context, you really understand the setting. There's a tendency to kind of overwrite, I think, and to be concerned that you've got to make this really theoretical now. And to making it theoretical ends up with research questions like that top one, instead of the one like the bottom one, which allows more insights to emerge. So that's one example that you may get. And if we've got PhD students here, it may be feedback you get from a supervisor as well, right? So that as you're writing, the concern is that you're trying to force, you're anticipating that you're going to get pushback on this being an extreme setting. And so, and you've got a set of findings and you're really excited about those findings, but you go back and rewrite a research question thinking that your findings and your question must fit. And so my experience of that is you end up with this kind of feedback from an editor and from reviewers that you're too tight with that question. It's over anticipating those findings, and then it reads like you're forced to framing on that extreme context data. So that's one thing I think to be mindful of. Another comment you'll often get. Click again to work. Okay, another one you'll get, fascinating context, right? So storm chasers, emergency departments, alpine skiing, whatever you're doing, I'm sure it's really fascinating, really, really fascinating. Often in the write-up, the concern will be from reviewers or supervisor will be, you don't have a strong enough theoretical contribution. So this is fascinating, but you have to make some kind of theoretical contribution. And Darren was talking before about the idea of eccentricity. So you can be as eccentric as you are competent. I actually think for publishing, you can be as eccentric as you are able to build theory, right? So you have to be able to make a theoretical contribution. It really doesn't matter what your context is if that context allows you to see things that will extend a conversation in the literature on something, right? And often you might not know what that is until you've collected, analysed the data, you've come up with something, and then you start to see, oh, this moves the literature forward in a way. Both of the papers that I'm talking about today, we got much clearer on what the theoretical contribution was later in the review process, and that's often the case with publishing papers. So, so you'll engage reviewers because your context is fascinating, but to get the paper published, you have to somehow make a theoretical contribution. That's true of all papers in top journals, but it's particularly true of extreme, I think it's particularly challenging for extreme context researchers because we're so excited about our context and think they're so unique, and it's that you have to somehow pull yourself back from what is this speaking to about other issues, because often it's the extremeness of the context allows you to see something that you can't see in a context that's not extreme, right? And so you can move theory forward in all sorts of areas beyond the extremeness of your context. If you think about what are the theoretical conversations this literature this data allows me to speak to, and often reviewers will help you with that. So if you want to click that, you'll get the comment we got from. Okay, so the reviewer on the AMJ paper basically told us that I think you have an opportunity to make a much more substantive theoretical contribution than the ones we were listing. So this would be first, round review process. In particular, the connection between institutional work and the notions of values is really interesting. So regardless of what we thought was going on in our data, we have a reviewer now telling us, this is the piece, this is the theoretical puzzle that I think your really interesting context, can speak to. So these ideas about institutional work and values are really interesting. Now you saw what the research question was that we first wrote up in the paper, which was about intentionality and agency. There's nothing about that here in what the reviewer is engaging with. So the other thing you want to try and do in those, again, shouldn't tell you what to do. What I like to do in the first submission of a paper is to always make sure that I show enough of the data so that if the framing that I've chosen and think is there, doesn't resonate for they can see other possibilities. There's other ways that you can extend a conversation forward. So we had a little bit of stuff about values, and we had stuff definitely on institutional work that they could see, and we had stuff about institutional guardians, and they were saying, the reviewers kind of guiding us, saying, go harder on these values. There's more that you can say about professions and values and institutional work associated with that our unique context is allowing us to kind of speak to, that's maybe some other context wouldn't. So we've got a reviewer kind of guiding us into areas of, where we can further strengthen our contribution. And the other thing, the relation between emotion, values, and micro-institutional processes. So this could potentially be a potentially significant contribution. Now, the interesting thing here about this particular paper was it went under review during that period of time where if you're an institutional theorist, or maybe nobody here is, so this might not be remotely interesting to anybody, but there was a point in time where there was a theory paper out on institutions and emotions. There weren't a lot of people with actual empirical data. There weren't a lot of researchers with empirical data on emotions and institutional work. But our setting, because it was a hospital emergency department, those moral emotions were incredibly visible, and they were moral emotions. So our paper ended up being one of the first that was pushing hard on these connections between moral emotions and institutional work that other researchers weren't able to expose to the extent or bring to the surface to the extent that we could. So that was the advantage of the extreme context setting, the emergency department. But part of what the write-up and the challenge for you in writing, me in writing things up is figuring out, like, what is it what's the theory here that we can connect with? So that's the other thing, I guess, I always think about when I'm reading papers that are published. They may not have gone, they look really clever, but they may not have gone in with that framing under the initial submission. So we had some stuff on emotions, we had it in our findings, but not necessarily kind of at the end, at the initial point. Yeah. So that was the reviewer's comment to us, was kind of hinting to us as to where we might go. So if you click down, it should give you our response. Yep. So, and these are literally word for word responses from our response document, right? So, you know, so if you've never written a response letter and are curious about how they work, if you're a PhD student or early career academic and have never seen what they look like for an AMJ paper, this is what they look like. So we've taken your comments on board, worked much harder to elaborate the contributions, as discussed in other comments, identified in our model the processes of values maintenance work to different problems, elaborate our contribution. So we're kind of pushing there. We've got a new process model. We've better understood these connections between emotions and institutional work. So you can see there in terms of what we're doing, the theoretical contribution has nothing to do with emergency departments as the extreme context, but you can see where we're moving theoretical conversations forward. So there's something about the emergency department that's allowing us to see it. And so there's an advantage in that in choosing these settings. But when you write them up, you know, it's important to think about what are the theoretical contributions that we can make, you know, that this setting is allowing us to do. But in the write-up, you have to push much harder on what those theoretical contributions will be. So if you click again, it should show you. So, so that's the model in the published paper. If you click the next slide first, Darren, it should give you the, so this was the original model that went in. So just trying to elaborate this idea of a theoretical contribution, that was the original submission. That's a terrible model. So it's kind of reinforcement work, repair work, renovation work. You can't really see much of what's going on. There's a bit of cognition and emotion. So there's lots of, you can kind of see there's kind of hitting on a number of concepts that we kind of thought we were pulling together. But if you go back to the previous slide, that's the model that was that we moved as we moved through the review process. We got much clearer on this idea of pushing harder on, you know, what our data really speaks to and what we can write a really interesting paper and make a contribution around is better understanding how emotions work and this idea of values. So how do the values of a profession, how are they maintained in this everyday work that happens in this extreme context of an emergency department, but which can speak more to the idea of professions in any context, professionals trying to maintain the value of a profession. And so that's kind of, you know, how the model kind of plays out. You can kind of see the different kinds of problems. If you look at the model there as well, you can see it's an abstract model. It doesn't apply specifically to an emergency department. It applies to professions, professional work, rather than the specifics of an emergency department. So that's the other piece I think I've learned over time is the way to better express a theoretical contribution. And, you know, is to think about what is this theoretically separate from my extreme context? What are the more abstract mechanisms, triggers and things that might be in play in my model that could apply to anything? So if you look at it, it doesn't say anything there about this needing to be an emergency department or an emergency physician. It's just professionals and how they're maintaining their values through their everyday work, right? So so that was that one. The next one, if you click Darren, it might give you our Ebola paper. So you go on. Yeah, so the ASQ paper, so that was a paper that was on, there's an interesting evolution to that paper in that Ebola happened a number of years before we actually published that paper. I couldn't figure out what was going on. It was the only time at my field site where there was any friction amongst these, and I'd been at that field site for a long time. So when we're trying to eventually write a paper around what we thought was going on, we end up with this very big complex. You can see how complex that model is, but it's also very specific. If you look at it, it's quite specific to how emergency departments work. So, you know, so it's all about someone turning up, making a claim, but it's specific to the idea of an emergency department as a place of social inclusion. So the new concept we were trying to develop was the idea of an institution, well, a special type of institution that hadn't been theorised in the literature, which was a place of social inclusion, and looking at an emergency department as one of those. So that was important theoretically, I guess, in moving us away from the emergency department idea. But if you look at that model, it's quite detailed and it's quite particular to our unique set of findings. And so as through the review process, as we got told by the editor, the model is too specific, that it fits too tightly to how an emergency department would work. But what we were trying to theorise was this bigger idea around a place of social inclusion, which could be an emergency department, or it could be a public school, it could be a public library, it could be a public defender court. We were arguing that there were these institutions in democratic societies that kind of upheld societal ideals about inclusion, but were based in local places and therefore, you know, had particular characteristics because of this local boundedness. So kind of that was the big idea. So that was the original model. The published model ended up being, if you click again, it should come up. See how that's a much, you probably can't read the words, but even visually, you can see it's less busy. It's the simpler ideas. You can see this connection between the local level of the place and the societal level, the place of social inclusion. So it's a much cleaner and clearer representation of theoretically what we were trying to say. And it moves us way away from the specifics of how an emergency department actually works and the bigger ideas that we had around this idea of an institution being a place of social inclusion. So it's still got some of the ideas from the original one, but if you compare the two models, you can see how there's been a lot more collapsing of where, you know, of where things are and what the bigger ideas are that held the paper together. So if you're trying to hone in on what your theoretical contribution might be, or at least as I do it, to build that theoretical contribution, it's helpful to try and think beyond your own specific extreme context and thinking more generally, if this, you know, what is this a case of? You know, is it a case, and when you're theorizing, and I guess I should also be saying, we weren't specifically looking to move forward the extreme context literature. If we had been, then we would have needed to better theorise the extreme context, because we're trying to move that literature forward. That wasn't the case with this theoretical contribution here. So that's probably the other piece I would say as well, when you're trying to think about in the write-up, where can you make that theoretical contribution? I would argue it's important to get that distinction. Which literature are you trying to move forward? Are you trying to move forward the extreme context literature and our understanding of extreme context and extreme events? If that's what you're trying to move forward, then you need to position your paper very clearly within that literature, and then the extremeness of it will be much more prevalent and present in your writing. If alternatively, which is what I do and what these examples are showing, is that I'm trying to build theory. I'm an institutional theorist, and I happen to be looking at extreme, emergency departments, and they're an extreme context. And so my papers, when I write them up, it's foregrounding of other literatures, and the extremeness of the emergency department plays out in the methods section of my paper and also in the findings. So, you know, and then so the bookending around it, it's much more these other literatures. But so that's probably, I should have probably started with that. Sorry. That's kind of a piece that you have to figure out, is which of these literatures are you going to see this paper in. So that's another one that often comes up, that it's fascinating. Your context is fascinating. The event you're looking at, fascinating, really, really, really interesting, but can't see the theoretical contribution. And so in terms of the write-up, it's figuring out which literature are you trying to make that contribution in, and writing in a way that's more clearly expressed, but also feeling some sense that what you're reading in those published papers, there's been help through the review process to figure out what that contribution is. So just, if there are any PhD students listening, I kind of would reassure you of that as well. Yeah, like this is a learned process and a helped process through good reviewers. The next one, Darren. Okay, so another one that will come up, or certainly comes up for me, but maybe less so now, is you'll get interesting data, but I can't see how you got those findings. So again, with an extreme context, you'll have all your cool quotes, which Darren was showing us about, the storm chasing, and see the photos in that, and Mark Duron stuff is always really awesome, and the videos and all of that. So there's all this really interesting, probably some of my stuff is pretty interesting. The Ebola stuff was obviously, oh, that's really interesting. But then you get this but I can't see how you got those findings. So you've developed some theorizing and a set of findings from that data. And then what you're doing in the write-up is you're showing all of your interesting data, but not in a way that the reviewer can see how it led to those findings. So one of the comments, probably it should give you the reviewer's comment, Darren, if you click. Yeah, so on the AMJ paper, yeah, so first round, one of the reviewers, we tricked two of the reviewers, but one of the reviewers realized, all right, you're showing me lots of stuff, but you're actually hiding a lot more. So you've got all the right references to methods, literature, you've got one of those, you know, data structure tables that you're supposed to have, but I can't really see what you've actually done with your particular data. And the editor said, yeah, well, reviewers 1 and 2 are satisfied. All right, you've tricked them. I now side with reviewer 3. This is a concern. Standardized displays that you're showing, you know, aren't really connecting with what matters for the analysis, right? So it's critical to convey how we actually got what we got. So this one here will be one you'll get often, even whether you're an extreme context researcher or not. But I also wonder when I do my emergency department stuff, because it's so fascinating, the data itself, you know, there can be this tendency to perhaps you've got your findings, but you're not writing them up in a way that really expresses that. So if you click down, it'll show you the Goya table that we had. So these are the standard ones you often see. So we presented one of those. So the challenge then was to figure out, now that we had to go back and reanalyze and had a better research question next time, was to figure out how do we, for the specific data that we collected, I collected in the emergency department, what's the best way to show that so that a reader can actually understand how we moved from data to theory, right? What's the best way to do that? So if you click, Darren, it'll show you. Okay, so then for me, it was, okay, figure out, well, how do I best show this? And for us, it was figuring out, okay, everything's a patient episode. So think about grouping together the field notes in a way that shows you this idea of values. You know, so we had observational data, interview data, and you can read in the paper how we coded, but it was kind of quite detailed, but coded in a way that you could see, here's the problem, here's the emotional response, here's the action. But if you click down, there is no longer any data structure figure in this paper. If you go back, you won't see one of those Goya tables at all. What you'll see is data tables like this, which gives you the example of a data episode around, so again, capturing something about the context, the extremeness of what's happening in an emergency department and what occurs, but then showing very clearly this is how we coded. So here's the perceived problem, giving an example, so you can see the data, you can see what we coded perceived problem, you can see the emotion and how we coded the emotion for that. You can see the work that was the response, and you can see what we're arguing the process was. So during the review process, we had a number of tables like that. They would go over 2 and 3 pages. I knew by the end of the review process, if the paper was getting accepted, I'd have to cut length. So that meant I would have longer tables during this stage that I could then pull back later, right? So, so kind of over, often with the review process, you'll end up with papers that have a fat middle. So you go in with the length that the journal asks. In the middle of process of the review, the paper will blow out because you're showing more of your data and you've got to make changes to respond. And at the back end, then you have to cull again. So this is how I ended up figuring out. I think I'd seen something a bit like it in another AMJ paper, and so I just used that, like episodes as unit of analysis or something. I call it based on this other one. And so this is kind of what we did. And so then we stopped getting those comments from the reviewers that we can't see how you coded that really extreme descriptive data to get your findings, because you can clearly see what we did. This is how, obviously the episodes are a lot longer in the real data, but you summarize them down for the purpose of displaying to a reader how you've moved from the extreme context through the model that you're developing. But you can see those headings kind of match that model we showed you before, that kind of the theoretical model. You can see now that they actually do build to that. Yeah, so those Goya and Corley, there's none of those in this paper. So that's kind of what we worked out, or I worked out, was the better way to display the data so that a reader could see what we were doing. And then if you click again, Darren, it should show you. Oh yeah. And then the written response then becomes very easy, where you can say, okay, we're now using these data display tables. You can see transparently how we're moving from text to the categories to the processes. They more clearly show. I think in the review process, the next time one of the reviewers wanted a data structure table, wanted us to put it back in, and the editor said no, that we didn't need it, that this was a much better approach for displaying our data. We didn't need both. And I guess that's what I kind of think about now, particularly for extreme context research. You don't have to be as formulaic in how you're describing your methods and how you're presenting things. It's what's appropriate to what you've actually collected. And often it's unique data. It's really interesting. You know, there are variables and things in play that aren't present there in other settings. So you have to figure out the best way to display that to support the theory that you're trying. I keep saying you, but sorry, it should be that's just what I do. You don't need to do what I do. Yeah, okay, so that's that one. And other one that comes up, sorry. So then we did if you look at the ASQ paper, I've figured out a way to present this emergency department data. It's the same idea. It's different data, completely different data, but it's the same idea that we've got this routine process. How can I show it? So again, more of these tables with an episode. So from my field notes, these ones are orientations, emotion, and a response. So it's the same idea. The data in both cases as well had two types, kind of this mundane routine actions that are coded like this, and then there's a disruptive case. So in the Ebola, the ASQ paper, the disruption is the Ebola. In the other paper, the disruption is where they make a systemic change. So, and they were written as cases. So it's kind of this kind of data and then a case. Yep, sorry, if you click again, Darren. Okay, so another reviewer comment you often get is extreme context event. The context or event is super interesting, but you don't have the right data. And this can happen in a couple of ways, but here's a couple of examples. So if you click down, sorry. Yeah, so with our AMJ paper, we were making claims about, thank you, yeah, there's some sites on it. Yeah, so we were making some claims about profession, but we'd only collected data in one hospital emergency department. So single site, but making claims about the institution level of the profession. So, and we only had the data from the emergency department. So the reviewer in the first round wasn't happy, thought we needed data for more, for more people. So we went back with, oh, we did, we had nurses and hospital managers. So then they came back with, if you click, Darren, sorry. Yeah, round two, they went, no, I have significant concern. Now it's a very significant concern about your methods. You need the additional data. And the voice that is missing is the physicians in the other departments. You have to present the other side. So, and you can see they're right? That's actually right. What we were trying to do with our model, what we were trying to theorize was the role of emergency physicians in, having these problems with other departments. And we had data only from the emergency department. So if we wanted to keep that theoretical framing and potential contribution, we didn't have any choice. You either get more data or your paper's done. So if you click, that was what we did. We just went and got more data. So I had access to the same field site. We went back. And then we were able to interview on the other side and collect more data to kind of support that. And then if you click again, Darren, we then presented a table like this as in the paper, and so that you can see the different rounds of data collection to support what we're trying to do. The next example of not having the right data is the Ebola one. So again, super interesting, an event, but you don't have the right data. So this time we had a field site, emergency department, and a paper about a disruption that was caused, which was to do with Ebola, but there was no confirmed case of Ebola, right? So it's an extreme event, super interesting, super interesting. You want to keep that element of it. But the reviewers were pushing back hard, or one reviewer, that we didn't actually have a confirmed case of Ebola. And so the way we resolved that was, it didn't really matter for our theorising whether they had a case or not. It was about the disruption that was caused because of those expectations of those potential cases. And then you can see the way we've divided the data up to show that actually there were 4 cases, right? We saw a whole lot more than that which weren't. but 4 cases where they thought they were Ebola patients, and one turned out to be they did have it, but they managed to get them to bypass the emergency department. So we were able to get around that idea of, so that one will come up a bit. Have you got the right data for what you want to show? Another one that comes up, literature doesn't queue up your findings. So this often will be that your theoretical framing doesn't fit the findings about the extreme context. So this one was, that they didn't think we sufficiently queued up the moral emotions. You can hit it again, Darren, and it'll probably tell you, and go again, what we appear to have. So, so that was the editor's comment. The beauty of that one is, if you look at the paper, what I've highlighted there, we actually put in the paper. So the editor has given us what they think the paper is really about. So then we're able to use that to support as we were kind of rewriting, you're getting guidance and advice, from them on what they think is important. So the theoretical framing didn't quite fit the findings. Then we had the editor telling us, well, here's what I think the theoretical framing should be. So thank you very much. And again, it resonated with me. Obviously, I wasn't expressing clearly enough what I thought was there. This is a better way of expressing what was going on in terms of framing the contribution. So then I think if you click, Darren, it should give you our response, which was kind of basically, thank you. Here's the question that we're now using. It better connects with the story. I think this is being recorded, so you can have a look at the slides with the actual responses if you're trying to figure out how to respond to reviewers. So that one will come up a bit if you go again. So moral emotions, so this is another one that often comes up for all qualitative researchers that are inductive, I think. Where do you put the thing that emerged in your findings? Where do you write it into paper? So moral emotions was something that was in our findings. So in the first original submission, we didn't mention moral emotions until the findings. And then, so they're going, you need to put that up front. So we responded, yep. So if you click down, it should come, yep. So now we've included a section on the values, how it might be relevant to exploring our question, put that up front. Then if you click again, you'll see in the next round of reviews, the editor said, actually, I don't think it belongs in the lit review. So even the papers themselves, where something goes, can move during the review process. So originally we thought it wasn't something we should say up front, this idea of moral emotions. It's emerged in the findings. So we put it in the findings. We wrote it in the findings and then in the discussion. Then the reviewers said it needs to be up front. Even if it's inductive, you have to flag something for the reader up front. So then we had a whole section up front on it. Then later in the review process, the editor went, no, don't think that's right. I think you just mentioned it briefly up front, but it actually belongs in your methods because that's when you're coding for this idea of moral emotions. And then again, they gave us another sentence where they told us what our core puzzle was, which if you look at the paper, you'll find that sentence is in there as well. So some of the writing of the extreme context during the review process is reviewers and editors helping you write, giving you text that helps. So if you click again, Darren, it should say, so then we said we've rewritten it to queue up the puzzle.